Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, January 20th, 2020. I call the meeting to order, and before we begin, let's acknowledge that we're holding this meeting on the traditional territory of the Wasanich people. And I'll move for an approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Any amendments or changes? Seeing none. All in favor? Carried. I'll move for approval of the minutes from the Committee of the Whole meeting of December 9th, 2019.
So moved. Second.
All in favor? Motion carries. And we're down to item 6A, Beacon Wharf Surveys and Feasibility Study. Is there a presentation? Okay, presentation by Jen Clary.
Good evening, everyone. I'm here to give a brief overview of SNC's report on Beacon Wharf surveys and feasibility study that they did for the town. Just to give you a bit of background about Beacon Wharf, it was divested by the federal government in 2006, and that's when the town took it over. It's an aging piece of infrastructure. It's needed repairs. It needed some repairs in 2012 that extended the life for 5 to 8 years. And then we're completing other repairs this year to extend the life for an estimated 3 to 6 years. Part of the downtown waterfront visioning exercise that the town did in 2017 identified replacing the wharf with a rubble-mounted structure. So we hired SNC to do this study for us, and we met to review the design criteria. It was all from the downtown waterfront vision, again, that the town had completed already. The design life is 50 years. The town would like commercial buildings that are open to the public on the wharf, pedestrian access at all times. We don't want to have to close down during storm events. Delivery trucks and maintenance vehicles and emergency vehicle access is required. Electrical, water, and sewer for the buildings on the wharf, and the ability to have short-term vessel mooring spaces. Feel free to stop me if you guys have questions throughout this. So SNC, when they started collecting data, they realized that their company actually had done the flood construction level report for District of North Saanich in 2017. So the town requested that we were able to use that information from North Saanich, and they gave us approval. So that was really valuable data to have as part of this study, because they wouldn't have been able to collect that much information with the amount of funding that was available for it. So they had collected information for all of Sydney, but they just hadn't analyzed it the same way they had analyzed the information from the District of North Saanich. So to give you an idea of the elevations that we're working with, so I'll go to the bottom point on this slide first. Most of the things that the town does, we measure in the geodetic datum, but the SNC used chart datum for their report. So 0 geodetic datum is plus 2.1 chart datum. So if you think the elevations are off, they're just on a different datum. So the existing wharf is actually at 5.5 meters chart datum. The existing roundabout at the end of Beacon Avenue is at 6.9 meters chart datum. And the town's interim flood construction level is at 7.1 meters chart datum. So you can see the difference even if we were to go with the town's current flood construction level from the existing wharf. And then through their analysis, the recommended replacement wharf flood construction level is between 8 meters and 11 meter chart datum. So to meet their required flooding and wave action, it needs to be raised quite a bit. So SNC did use a conservative approach based on wave action and storm events for the next 50 years. They considered a 0.8 meter sea level rise, and it also considers the use of space. So because we wanted a landmark building on the wharf and pedestrian access at all time, it considers the safety of pedestrians and damage to property. So those elevations would prevent that.
Councilor McNeil.
So on the recommended replacement wharf line, which is FCL plus 8 to plus 11, so that's a difference of 3 meters, about 9 feet plus. when would it be determined which number you would go with, or have to go with? Because 9 feet's a lot.
Mm-hmm. So they have a series of recommendations that they looked at. So SNC's initial the project they were working on was supposed to look at 2 options for Beacon Wharf. It was to look at Beacon Wharf on a rubble mound structure the same size as it is now, and then expanded for what it is now. But when they started looking at the numbers, instead of doing that, they looked at several options, which I'll get into later, and they looked at them more broadly. So they didn't get into as much detail, but so they did present some options between 8 meters and 11 meters chart datum, and it's kind of up to us and council how much we want to spend on this, and what option we want to move forward with.
So each option has a particular value, not a range.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do note that now. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any other? No. Okay. So option 1. So in their options, some of them were just not recommended by SNC based on the wave action that would be a result of them, and this is one of them. This is the most in line with waterfront vision. It's rebuilding the wharf on a rubble mound structure at its existing elevation. So that estimate cost is $13.7 million, and that's the cost of the wharf only. It doesn't include any of the buildings or any additional services on the wharf. So that's an estimate based on the amount of material that's required to build it. Option number 2 was also not recommended by SNC because of the wave action over the next 50 years. This is building the wharf at the town's existing FCL of 7.1 meters, and they used a piled option for this one. The cost of that would be about $8.5 million, and it's 1.6 meters higher than the existing wharf. Option number 3, it's kind of the luxury option. You can be walking on the wharf during a really big storm and not get wet from the waves. This is there's rubble mounted, and then it's got a parapet wall to keep the pedestrians safe or dry. This one isn't recommended by them just because of it's very big, and it's kind of like unnecessarily over-designed, but it's $20.8 million, and it would raise the wharf 5.6 meters higher than the existing level. So SNC did shortlist a few options, ones that the town might want to look at further based on the cost and the level of the wharf. This one is building a stepped berm structure, so right out here, that would actually break the wave action before it got to the top of the wharf. And for this one, it would be about 9 meters high, cost about $14.2 million to build. So again, that's about 3.5 meters higher than the existing wharf. And just to let you know, I'm 1.75 meters tall, so that's 2 of me higher than the existing wharf. So the next shortlisted option is option 5A. This is a piled wharf with a modified footprint. You can see here. It's kind of a hammerhead option. It would be more parallel to the shore. You don't get quite as much wave action because you're not sticking out further into the water. This option as well, they recommended a height of 9 meters. So again, 3.5 meters higher than the existing wharf. And it's $8.7 million to build approximately. Option 5B is the least expensive of the options that they presented. This is a smaller footprint, so it's about half the footprint of the existing wharf on a piled structure. Again, the height is fairly high, 3.5 meters above the existing wharf, and it's $6.3 million to build. Option 6, this is the lowest elevation of the feasible options. Again, it's a stepped berm so that the wave action breaks a little bit out. And it's a modified footprint, so it comes by the shore, the hammerhead option again. So this one would cost about $14.1 million. It would only be 2.5 meters above the existing Beacon Wharf, which is still pretty high, but.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In this particular option, roughly how much would the hammerhead be in area comparable to existing wharf?
They use the same area, so they tried to make it equivalent area to the existing wharf.
So that would be equivalent.
That's what they are going for, yeah.
Committee member Duncan?
Thanks. I know. I was just looking to see when we start talking about how much higher these would be, and they say that the maximum grade should be 1 to 20 without handrails or 1 to 12. And I couldn't see on the pictures in the report because they're very tiny. Does it say on there what grade they achieved with that length there? Like how steeply up would you be walking up the? It seems so strange to walk upwards out the pier.
Yeah,
Is it shown?
they didn't do a model like that to
Okay.
show what it would look like from the roundabout. But yeah, they didn't really look at that. We would have to look at that in detailed design to look at how, because right, this wharf would be higher than Beacon Park, so look at how that would interact with each other. You could have it totally separate, or you could have steps going up to it or something. That would be sorted out in the design of the
Mhm.
wharf if we did decide to move forward with this. Yes.
Committee Member O'Keefe?
Thank you. So my questions are about trying to understand options 5A versus 6. So I'm just trying to, first of all, it looked to me that the shape and the size of the deck is the same amount of area between the two. And so, but the 5A is on pier,
Piles.
piles.
Mhm.
Yeah, and the other one is reclamation. So the way I understand, so I guess I'm just looking at if they're basically the same size, it's a different process to get them there. But number 6 is a lot more expensive. So is it, aside from the process of the reclamation versus the piles, is there anything more significant we would get out of option 6 for that versus option 5A for the additional, like roughly $6 million?
So option 6 is a meter lower than option 5A.
Oh,
Option
so
5A was
is-
higher.
Okay,
It was 3.5 meters above the existing wharf instead of 2.5 meters. And the reason it's so much more expensive is because of all the material here.
yeah,
It shows you where the material will be going. So we need to purchase all that material and place all that material. Whereas the like a wooden wharf structure with wooden piers is a little bit cheaper. Wooden piles is a little bit cheaper. So yeah, it's the height would be the difference.
so, sorry, clarify that. So,
Mhm.
so option 6 is higher.
Lower. Option
Lower.
6 is lower by a meter, yeah, than
Oh.
option 5A.
Isn't higher better?
Not if you're looking at sight lines and
Okay.
connectivity, because they're
Okay.
all higher than the existing Beacon Park. So I guess it doesn't.
Okay.
Maybe 3.5 meters doesn't make that much of a difference than 2.5 meters. It's something we
Okay.
need to look at.
Right, okay. And so my understanding of the different options, that it sounds like the piled options they're cheaper and they're better environmentally. Is it,
They take up less seabed floor, so there would be less
right, okay.
impact to the environment as far as seabed floor goes.
And one last question I had, if I may, just in regards to the, a piled structure, so there was mention that, it's cheaper and environmentally friendly, but the downside might be that there need to do some additional analysis of the bedrock and the silt in that area, and whether existing piles might be an obstacle. So I guess I'm wondering, if we did decide to go for a piled structure, how big of a hurdle or obstacle are those things in terms of extra time or cost or complexity?
It's hard to say. Something else about a piled structure is you wouldn't be able to have all year round moorage, short-term moorage, if you do a piled structure, because it doesn't break the waves to
Okay.
protect the boats. So that's another drawback of a piled structure. So there are additional pros and cons of each option, which we'll need to look at further. I can't
Okay.
I can't say for sure how much more of an obstacle that is
Yeah,
at this time,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Mayor McNeilson?
Thank you. Of the shaded area, the gray area that includes the deck and the lead up to the of that would be allowed, the vehicles would be allowed?
So when they were looking at designing it, they were designing it for maintenance vehicles and delivery vehicles. So you're asking how far up there they would be allowed, or?
Okay, so those vehicles would be allowed right out on the deck.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Councilmember
One more.
O'Keefe?
So just related to the vehicles and buildings on the structure, so these are being, the current options are designed for that. And then, so if the decision was made that, no, we're not gonna have permanent buildings, or we're gonna bring in food trucks, or there's some other interesting ideas posed there, are you able to comment at all on the, how significant the reduction in price might be if we decided, okay, you know what, we're not gonna have permanent buildings there, so we don't have to have as stringent rules in place in terms of, wave action and all that sort of thing. 20% or 10% or reduction.
I think the big takeaway from this is, well, piled structure is much more affordable, much cheaper than a rubble mound structure. So if we're going a rubble mound structure, like the option 1 was rubble mound at the existing height, which is $13.7 million. So if we do rubble mound at any height, it's fairly expensive. If we do a piled structure at a lower elevation, because we're not having permanent buildings on it, it's hard to say. I don't think it'd be too much cheaper than these options here, because it's just shorter piles.
Right,
So.
okay. Yep, thanks.
Option 7 is another thing they looked at, is a submerged breakwater. So this is just to build a submerged breakwater out in front of the wharf to break the wave action offshore. And we'd still need to rebuild the wharf in some way. So this $9.8 million estimate is just the cost of that breakwater. It's not to build the wharf. And if we went this approach, we could build a lower wharf potentially. I don't know how much lower. They would need to do more analysis on it, but that's an option. We asked them, because part of the waterfront vision is a rock reef in front of Glass Beach. So we asked them to analyze that at the same time, because they were out collecting information for the environmental assessment. So they looked at that as well. They found it would be feasible to do a small breakwater like this, similar to the one that would protect the wharf, would be $1.2 million. There might be other options to do something less robust. In this is what they looked at, though. And this not provide any protection for the wharf. It would just be to enhance Glass Beach. So from this study and report, we have a lot more questions than we do answers. Some of the outstanding questions, this is just a small list of the many more I'm sure you guys could think of. Are permanent buildings actually required on the wharf? Is there a business case for this? What wharf size and configuration would the town be happy with? What are the ongoing maintenance costs of each option? Because a piled option would most likely be more maintenance. Life cycle costs probably similar to a rock structure option. What's the maximum height that we would be happy with for a wharf as far as sight lines and lining up with the surrounding land? Is it practical to build a new wharf in phases? That's something that they looked at. You could build maybe a lower wharf and then 20 years down the line build a breakwater out in front of it. Is that something we'd be willing to do? Is short-term mooring required? As I mentioned, if we build a piled structure, it's much more difficult to do year-round short-term mooring. Or are there alternate options, mooring options at adjacent commercial properties? Are there coastal protection pilot projects? Could we look at a breakwater as kind of a pilot project to potentially look at the rest of Lochside Drive? Do we want a rock reef at Glass Beach? Do we look at removing the wharf and reimagining the waterfront vision? Is the cost of the wharf worth the value? And what is the best way to engage the community to get some of these answers for this? As I said, there's many, many more questions, I'm sure. But what what we're recommending is to develop a select committee of council that would consist of the mayor, a councillor, key staff, and 2 to 3 members of the public that would be appointed by council. The first order of business would be to develop terms of reference for council's review, and then they would report back to council in 6 to 8 months on how we might be able to move forward with this information. We recommend it existing till December 31st, 2020.
Councilmember Wainwright?
Thank you. I guess one of the things I'm wondering about, these options involve, well, all the options involve increasing the height of the wharf and relative to the roundabout on Beacon. And I guess I'm wondering about the extent of road and streetscape improvements that are going to be necessary to connect to something higher. And, you know, what the, I guess, slope of that road's going to be and all that. Did they consider that when they were doing cost estimate? So that's all kind of over and above.
Yes, that would be all.
And the waterfront walkway, we want to connect through that as well, so there's issues with that. So all of that needs to get looked at. Okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
Committee Member Fallot?
What he said.
Hey, Committee Member Duncan?
Well, I guess, in addition to that, when I started looking at it and thinking, if our FCL is 7.1 and we are looking at all of this for the wharf, and then I think the storm event that our wharf survives, there's water running over the street and over the park and over the walkways, and I start thinking, well, that means we're going to be budgeting in a lot of extra money for street repairs and the repair of the infrastructure under the streets, all of the pedestrian walkways down there, the park itself. And I kind of wonder how wise it is for us to be planning to continue building things out into the ocean when it looks like a lot of the stuff that's near that shore is going to be getting very expensive to maintain going into the future. And we'll have a beautiful wharf and stuff. The walkway along Tallista Park, we can already see what the effects of that starts to look like when we get the waves overtopping. So we haven't looked at that at all as well.
Anybody else? Thank you. There's a recommendation.
I'll move the recommendations that council receives the report for information, that council directs staff to establish a Beacon Wharf Select Committee that will consist of that will exist until December 31st, 2020, and consist of the mayor, 1 councillor, key staff, and 2 to 3 members of the public appointed by council. That once established, the Beacon Wharf Select Committee be tasked with developing a terms of reference for council's review and consideration.
All in favor?
Oh, if I could,
Discussion?
Sorry.
one question regarding that. Do we have any budget proposed for that particular process and the community engagement and all that stuff that may be necessary?
At this point, no.
Thank you.
Committee Member O'Keefe?
And while I noticed that the motion is that the committee will come back to council, it will be exist till December 31st. I guess the terms of reference, do we need to identify a time frame or that, like within 30 days or 60 days, or did we have I'm just wondering whether we had an idea of when that might take place, or?
So is the question when we'll come back with respect
Yeah,
to
so in
reference?
Yeah, just because it had said that they would prepare terms of reference and then come back to council by December 31st. So I'm presuming the terms of reference will be far before December 31st. So I'm just wondering, 30 days or?
No, the committee will exist, but it will report back to council by December 31st. So
I guess what I was wondering about the terms of reference coming back to council, would it be reasonable to expect that, say, within 30 days? Or is,
as soon as practicable.
oh, okay. And I guess just, I looked at some of the items that would be included in the terms of reference. They're all good things. Just a couple of other things that came to my mind for consideration, and maybe they would be already, is about consulting with the marina next door to review what their plans might be. So if they have plans, obviously, for short-term and temporary moorage, then that maybe means that we don't have to consider that. I'd also be interested to find out what the potential options might be for revenue streams to the town from a new wharf, that would, from, if there was new buildings, to help mitigate the costs. And also consider how the future of Bevan Wharf might impact the use or plans for Beacon Wharf. So if there's a plan that maybe that's not going to be replaced, or there's things that we might or might not do there, how might that impact what we want to do on the Beacon Wharf? And also whether there'd be any information about how the requirements for the environmental offsets that are required and the associated costs for those, for a structure on piles versus rock reclamation, would impact the overall costs. So for example, if there's one option where the price is 10 million, but there might be another several million required for environmental offsets, it would be good to have that information available when we look at all the options. That's all I have.
Anything else from anybody? Any questions? No. Mr. Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Thank you, Chair. I would just comment that with some of the comments by colleagues, including Councillor Duncan, that while we've received information about options for the wharf and roadway leading up to it, and that this committee will have to consider the implications on adjacent infrastructure, whether it's pathway, whether it's park, whether it's other roadway or the beach, and the larger consideration of this is just one aspect of the total waterfront in Sydney.
Seeing no other discussion, all in favor? Opposed? None? Motion carried. For item 6B, park funding, and I believe Councillor.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I brought this forward for discussion with the mayor's consulting, and I really would like all of council be present, and Councillor Rintoul isn't available this evening, so I would make a motion that we table this discussion for a future committee of the whole, not too far in the distance, but certainly leave it up to staff to find discretion.
Second that.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? None? Motion carries. And item 6C, the draft 2020 to 2024 financial plan, presentation by Mr. Hissick. The floor is yours.
Normally I warn people they can leave before this. I didn't have to this time.
council, esteemed colleagues, members of the public. This is welcome to my 8th financial plan presentation. Hopefully they get better every year, but I'll leave that up to you. So today is the introduction of the financial plan. And just a quick legislative overview of what we're doing here. The community charter requires that we adopt a new 5-year financial plan every year. And each plan covers a rolling 5-year period. And until the new one's adopted, we are operating under last year's, and it's still valid. And the financial plan establishes the operating framework for the year and is what the tax rates are based on. Our process is well established. It's generally a 3-stage process. The first one being introduction, where I stand up in front of you and introduce the budget for your consideration. You each have your budget binders to look through for the next presentation. I just don't think it's fair to give you a large document without any introduction and expect questions at the next meeting. So I like to give an overview and allow you to kind of take in the introduction and maybe ask some clarification questions. And then next time we reconvene on February 3rd, it's our first opportunity to get into more detailed discussions, ask some more questions. And at that time, there's an opportunity for public input as well. The third stage of our process is scheduled to occur on the 18th of February at a special council meeting. So there will be an updated presentation of any decisions that were made up to that point. Direction from the previous meetings will be incorporated into a new draft. And once again, the members of council as well as the audience will have a chance to weigh in. The ultimate goal of that third presentation is that the budget is approved on that night. However, if additional time is needed, we can schedule one or more meetings, which we have done on one occasion in my time up here. The goal tonight is just to introduce the 2020 to 24 financial plan. Not just to council, but also to the public. So you have your binders now. One is available at the counter, and at some point tomorrow there will be information on the town's website for community purposes. Another goal tonight is to give a brief overview of the major budgetary impacts that we're looking at as we go through the financial plan process. And also outlining some of the major capital projects and supplemental items that form part of the new budget. It's basically to add context for your review of the materials and of the budget itself. I'd like to get right to it. What's our starting point? And this year we're going into deliberations at 2.98%. Of a general tax increase, which is roughly half of where we were last year. Unfortunately, this new council's first budget was a challenging one, where we went in at a much higher increase than normal, due largely to external requests from our partner organizations. There are fewer of those this time around, and we've made full use of additional funding sources available to us to come in at a lower level. Included in that are supplemental items and some new capital items that we'll go through tonight. And I'll try and identify some of the areas where we will likely be focusing on over the next 2 meetings as we look to reduce or increase that starting number. A quick overview of some of the terms we'll be throwing out there throughout this process, a bit of a glossary, if you will. We've got water, sewer, and general funds, for lack of a better term, in that each one is self-funded. So the general fund is primarily funded from taxation. Water and sewer funds, they're primarily funded from water and sewer parcel taxes and user fees. Each one of those has an operating and capital component, and I'll highlight key features of all these different funds. Capital budget, that generally represents renewal of existing infrastructure or purchase of new assets. And we like to present it in components. So there's renewal of assets, ongoing programs, and then new projects. All the various funding sources are going to be identified for you, and the level of annual tax funding is likely what'll get the most discussion, but we should look at the various other items as well, because they also have an impact. What we call supplemental requests, these are in the operating budget, and they're changes to existing service levels. So new or additional programs or services. They're often one-time studies or minor operating items, but they can also be major ongoing items, such as what we had a number of years ago being the firefighter hiring plan, which was phased in over a number of years. It's fully phased in now and has no real additional impact, but, well, you could argue that there still is, but it's been fully absorbed. So as mentioned, a lot of these supplemental items are coming at us from external organizations. There are fewer of those this year, but that does tend to fluctuate from year to year. And the more significant items, even though everything's described in your documentation, the most significant ones will be backed up by more detailed reports for the next meeting. When we talk about service levels, we develop the base budget to basically maintain existing levels of service as approved by council during past budgets. So what does it cost to provide the level of service that you guys have approved in the past? We use our collective experience along with all the latest external information to determine the cost of delivering that prior approved level of service. We don't budget for worst case, only the most likely scenario to hit us. And that's based on our many years of experience. I mean, I'm the one standing here in front of you, but we've got 10 or 12 of our budget managers, our management team, who really did all the work in putting the budget together. I just come along and kind of tie the loose ends at the end of the day. So the various departmental budgets are developed on that basis. We look at the bottom line for each function. We don't spend too much time worrying about the individual line items within each budget. The individual line items are our best guess each and every year as to what mix of contract, materials, and labor it'll take to deliver the services for that year. And it's certainly not always an increase for every department. It's we look for efficiencies wherever possible, and as I go through the various departmental areas, you'll see what I mean. Reserves are another commonly used term, and in preparation for the budget, Council recently received a number of reports on our reserves and our gas tax funds, and I think that was a good precursor to the discussions we're going to have in the next couple of months. So reserves are generally set aside for specific purposes like asset replacement. We also have some less defined reserves like the general capital, the amenity reserve. We spent some time defining that recently. Things like gas tax, land sale, those are more of a general purpose, subject to some restrictions on use. And we talked recently about what's the required balance in each of our reserves, and some of them are more self-explanatory than others. Things like vehicles, equipment, that's fairly easy to determine. Our infrastructure, that's an ongoing process as we try and get closer to that required number. And reserve balances will be cyclical. Some years we'll be putting in more than we take out. We have a limited number of reserves for things like buildings and waterfront infrastructure. So when we had that presentation on the Beacon Wharf just now, and just so you know, there is no money set aside for that. So if we're looking at a replacement for that or Bevan Pier one day, I anticipate it'll be a mixture of grants, if any are available, as well as any available funding that we might qualify for, perhaps a little bit of gas tax. Maybe we'll have some amenity funding or land sale reserve funding, but chances are we'll have to borrow for anything large that we're not setting money aside for. If it's deemed a worthy public initiative, then borrowing has to be considered a viable alternative to fund it. We talked about asset management, infrastructure replacement, the sufficiency of funding for that. We are getting closer to giving you a number, but it does take time over and above our regular workloads. And it's all incremental. The information we collect from year to year, it helps us get a little bit closer to that ultimate number. But then you get new things like sea level rise thrown into the mix, and all of a sudden you're having to work another variable into it. And not all assets have to be replaced through reserve. As I mentioned, borrowing is a viable alternative. And debt. It's important to note that borrowing in the municipal context is very much different from senior governments who tend to borrow to also finance their ongoing operations. So senior governments incur operating deficits that they borrow for through bonds and so on, and just raise money to pay for annual services, not just capital works. We are limited to borrowing for capital. So that's why I'm a little more comfortable in recommending it if required, as opposed to borrowing for basically because we can't afford to pay as we go for our operations. We are limited under the community charter for how much we can borrow, and it's based on annual debt servicing costs, and we are nowhere near, not even remotely near our limits. Not that I would ever recommend getting near them, but just to give you some comfort that we have a long way to go. And we can borrow short-term for any minor capital projects up to $585,000, which is based on our population. That's $50 per resident. We can borrow for a smaller capital project if need be without any sort of process. But that's a 5-year term. Quick overview of where we are in terms of borrowing. So we only have 3 purposes, if you will, for which we borrowed money over the last 10-15 years. One is Telista Park improvements. Originally borrowed $850,000, and we're down to an estimated $150,000 as of the end of last year. We borrowed $3 million for Lochside, Iroquois, and the Works Yard. We're still less than a third of the way into that. It's fairly recent. But if you look at the improvements to Iroquois Park as well as the improvements to the Lochside Waterfront Trail, I think most people will agree it was a good use of funds. And of course, the community safety building, we've borrowed $5.5 million to date. Additional $3 million to come in the spring for a total of $8.5 million, with $6 million of that being for the town's purposes, the other $2.5 million being for the ambulance. So the annual debt servicing for all of the above is just over $500,000 on a gross basis, but if you factor in the recovery from the BC EHS, the ambulance lease, that takes $175,000 a year off of that for the next 20 years. So the maximum allowable debt servicing is $4.8 million. As you can see, we're well under that. Even after we factor in the last of the CSB borrowing, a quick estimate shows that we still have up to $7 million we can borrow a cent free. Not that this council would ever do that, but it is available. Quick look at the CSB borrowing. So this is actually identified as a net decrease from last year's budget. So the debt servicing for this year is approximately $112,000 less than last year because of largely the impact of the full year of the BC ambulance recovery. So based on the total amount borrowed. The first amount was locked in the fall of 2017. The last one will be in March or April of this year. And the impact on the average residence from, once the final amount is borrowed in 21, it'll be less than $35 a year, so roughly 2%, equivalent of 2% tax increase overall for the construction of the CSB. And most of this has already been factored in through past tax increases. So moving on to the water operating fund, that primarily is for the distribution of water, which we purchase in bulk from CRD Water. And our budget covers the bulk water purchase and the operation and maintenance of the distribution system, infrastructure renewal, and a small number of capital projects. It's funded with the water parcel tax and user fees. You'll recall that last year we had a $5 increase to the parcel tax for the first time in many years. It went up to $65 a year, and we had our first increase in user fees for probably 8 years, up to $6.50 per 1,000 gallons. Good news is that no increases are being proposed for this upcoming year. You'll note that the past few years we've been telling you that a review of the rate structure for both water and sewer has been ongoing. We did undertake, we started that process in late 2018, and it's been ongoing through all of 2019, but it's a complex analysis, and we found as we got into it that we had some gaps in our data that had to be filled. So we've done that, and we've continued modeling different scenarios, but it is an ongoing project that we will complete in 2020. And the ultimate goals are to develop a rate structure that, first of all, maintains revenue certainty, provides a clear distinction between fixed and variable costs of operating the system, recovers variable costs according to usage of the utilities, treats all classes of user fairly and equitably, and is not a sudden radical shift in billing methodology. And this will come forward to council in stages. You'll have to weigh in on different policy options at an early stage and possibly on an ongoing basis. As with every policy decision, there are, for lack of a better way to put it, winners and losers. There are some people that will be better off under a proposed new rate structure and some that will be worse off. But what we hope to show is to convince council and the community that it's an equitable result where we end up. So you're really paying for costs based on how much you use the utilities. Moving on to sewer operating. It includes our share of the unified treatment plant, operation and maintenance of the collection system, as well as infrastructure renewal and capital projects. So we've had treatment for over 20 years now in the peninsula. We won't be hit by many of the impacts that the Corps is seeing the last few years. Again, it's funded internally from sewer parcel taxes and user fees. The parcel taxes went up slightly last year. User fees stayed the same, and no increases are proposed for the upcoming year. Moving on to the general operating fund, it provides for all municipal functions except water and sewer. And, well, you could say garbage too, but that's rolled into the general fund. So the program areas are legislative and government services, protective services being police, fire, emergency programs, building inspections, bylaw enforcement, engineering and works, garbage collection, municipal planning, and parks, as well as cultural services and fiscal, which consists of reserve transfers, debt payments, and community support. Some of the larger impacts on the general operating fund for 2020, we have an additional $112,000 plus earmarked for current capital funding. reserve contributions are up by $80,000. There is an inflation factor built into those contributions to keep up with the costs of infrastructure. Supplemental requests, we're looking at a net increase of $153,000 over last year's. Debt servicing, as I mentioned, is a net decrease of $112,000. CSB building and grounds maintenance, about $36,000 due to the added size of the building and the grounds. The RCMP contract is going up by a modest $29,000. So the 2020 core operating budget, a general inflationary increase has not been included across the board, as is our norm. We haven't done that since 2009. We only increase the areas where it's actually required. So things like utility costs that are external to us that we know of that we can't control, certain contractual obligations. The additional revenue through the growth in tax base is the first offset before we apply a tax increase. We're looking at a modest $130,000 for this year. I was expecting more, but it's a little slow in rolling in. I am projecting closer to $200,000 for the next 4 years. Big table, lots of numbers. I don't expect anyone to be able to see it, but the purpose of this is to show that by department, they don't go up every year. It's really a reflection of where the focus areas are for each department from year to year. So general government, for instance, we had an increase in 2016, we had a decrease in 2017, modest increases in 2018 and 19, and now a larger one for 20. Then you look at engineering and works. Again, some years you're going to see decreases in their overall budget, and some you'll see increases. So all that this illustrates is that it's not an across-the-board increase, and there's different focus areas for each year. Sometimes it's supplemental requests that affect these. Sometimes it's just general inflation factors that impact one particular department. Often it's policing, but this year it's a little more modest. This is a graphical illustration of 5 of our larger departments, just to show what happens from year to year to their net operating budgets. So as you can see, it goes up and down depending on the circumstances. So going through the various departments one by one, legislative services and general government, we're looking at a net increase of $79,000 over last year, which is roughly 4.2%, on a total net budget of close to $2 million. $50,000 of that is a supplemental item that we'll look at in more detail later. $15,000 increase in legal fees. We tried decreasing it last year, but we're finding that we're just going through it. For various reasons, some internal, some external. We're just spending more on legal fees than we've been trying to budget for the last few years. RCMP, we're looking at a net increase of $53,000 from last year, which is 2.2%. The RCMP contract, the budget's only going up $29,000 because even though the per capita contract cost is going up more than that, I'm factoring in more of an expected savings from vacancies in the 15 allocated positions. Fire and emergency is going up $91,000 over last year. Got $16,000 in supplementals. We've got $29,000 increase in building and grounds maintenance, as I mentioned earlier. There are ongoing training needs and additional transfers required for the vehicle replacement. Building and bylaw, it's a modest increase of $15,000. Some of that is a supplemental request. Development services, a net increase of about $30,000. Largely, it's the second phase of the OCP review that's causing that, but there's also the full year of costs from last year's reorganization. Engineering and works, you're looking at a net decrease of $13,000 on a net budget of $2.1 million. They've done a great job of holding the line and making do with the existing budgets. And the fact that they've been busy on capital and haven't been able to fully spend their maintenance budgets, that does contribute to that, but a great job by the whole team on keeping it, holding the line. Parks and Cultural, we've got a net increase of $40,000 on a budget of over $1.5 million. And all of that is for supplemental requests, including the one from the museum. Fiscal services went up $120,000. It's the debt servicing decrease, reserve transfer increase, and community support increase, largely the $80,000 request from the Shaw Center that you heard recently. So supplementary items, there are one-time or ongoing additions to existing service levels, and even though they haven't been approved yet, they've all been built into the draft tax increase, so that if any are not approved, we're going to lower that tax impact. Going through the major supplemental items for 2020, you've got an additional $45,000 in funding for the OCP review in 2020, plus $50,000 more in 2021. That combined with the carry forward from last year, we're looking at about $150,000, which we could look to increase in 2021, depending on what happens with the hiring of a consultant later this year. The Shaw Center is looking for $80,000 above last year's level. We're looking at $50,000 in the admin budget for a civic site analysis. It's to look at the future of all our buildings, especially the town hall, to see how much lifespan there might be and what options there might be for replacement. A $50,000 new transfer to the ferry reserve is another supplemental request, and $20,000 in annual funding to the museum. Other smaller items make up $52,000. The total 2020 impact is just under $300,000. If you deduct the one-time request from 2019, you're looking at a net impact of $153,000. The Economic Development Fund is something that's been highlighted in recent years. Just to let you know, we're going in at the traditional level of $100,000 into 2020 with no carry forward of unspent funds from last year because there isn't that much. And roughly $33,000 of that remains unallocated when you factor in all of our prior commitments to the BIA and to SIP. And right now, there is no SIP funding beyond 2020. We're expecting them to come back to us in the fall with a request for an additional term. I'm guessing it'll be 5 years, but at this point, we are not including anything. So obviously, people wonder where their tax dollars are going, and this provides a general overview. So about 18.4% of the general operating fund, so the tax-funded stuff, goes to police protection. Another roughly 14.6% to public works and engineering. 15%, just under, to general government, which includes finance, administration, council, IT, a lot of common overheads. 12% to fire and emergency. 11% to community support. Another 11.6% to transfers to reserves. 11% was to Parks and Rec. 6.6% to community support. Debt servicing is roughly 3.2% of our operating budget. Moving on to capital. For 2020, we're looking at a capital program of 10.1 million in projects, which is broken down into about 4.66 in replacement projects, being infrastructure and other assets. 175,000 in annual ongoing capital projects, things like street lighting, underground wiring, small equipment, and those things. 2.4 million in projects carried forward from last year for completion. Almost half of that is for an underground wiring project at 3rd and Sydney. Also the maintenance on the Bevan Pier. And we've got 2.9 million in what I classify as new projects, even though you've heard about some of them and maybe even pre-approved some of them. The Ray Creek Dam being 900,000 of that. There's also another underground wiring project that council's already approved but hasn't actually been included in a financial plan, so it's classified and for this purpose as new. Also have public washrooms, a couple of park improvements, and we'll get into the details. So how is that 10.1 million funded? Reserves fund the vast majority of it at 6.1 million. Gas tax, another 1 million or so. Developer contributions, another 918,000. A large part of that is again for the recurring underground wiring. You've got a very small portion of debt in there, 45,000 in what used to be called MFA lease financing, but now it's just short-term borrowing. About 536,000 in funds carried forward from previous years, and this is tax funds from previous years. About just under 400,000 in taxes and user fees, 600,000 or so in grants, 200,000 or so from North Saanich for RCMP items, and about 178,000 in other sources. So we allocate a small amount of property tax funding each year to fund capital. And our level of tax funding for 2020 is about 317,000, which is about 113,000 more than last year. But it's still lower than what it used to be historically, which is closer to $500,000. But this is more our new normal of about 300,000. And that's been made possible by the use of external funding sources like gas tax. In terms of significant projects, we've got close to 14 million in infrastructure replacement over the next 5 years. We'll get into a bit more detail on that in the next budget meeting, but looking at our infrastructure replacement, at that level, it's bordering on unaffordable. We need to really have a close look at how much we're putting aside, how much of this is must-have as opposed to nice to have. And I think it's inevitable that we will have to put more in annually to our replacement reserves, but when that happens, when we know what amount we need to build up to, it'll be a phased-in increase. So we've got 1.65 million in other asset replacement funding for 2020. Those are primarily their vehicles, computer equipment, as well as some work at the ferry terminal. Ray Creek Dam is 900,000 plus future park improvements, which are not yet budgeted for in future years. 400,000 for public washrooms over the next 3 years. And Rathdown Park, 200,000 in 2020 as phase 1 of the first park to be undertaken pursuant to the detailed Parks Master Plan. A very long list of our replacement plan projects. This is outlined in your binders, so this is just to illustrate how many replacement projects we have for this upcoming year. And this is again in your binders, but this is a listing of what I call new projects for 2020. So these are ones that we'll likely spend a bit of time discussing and council will get a chance to weigh in on whether these should all proceed or not. Quick overview of some of our non-traditional funding sources. Gas tax is one external source that's really allowed us to fund more and more capital over the last 5-10 years. So we have just over $1 million in capital projects funded from gas tax in 2020. Another $654,000 next year, tapering down a little bit. And there is some extra capacity should council decide to bring some projects forward from future years, or perhaps fund some eligible projects. I think the last couple of years we've been able to take some tax-funded projects and throw some gas tax at it instead to reduce the taxes. There aren't that many of those left. We've tried to pre-plan that for you this time. So even though we do have some funding, it'll be tough finding eligible projects to throw the money at. You can supplement infrastructure replacement, but that's a decision for a future meeting. New for this year, I want to focus on two other reserves, one being the amenity reserve, on which we had a policy discussion not too long ago. So I've tried to make use of this and the land use reserve to try and accelerate some of the capital projects that staff brought forward. So we've got some money going into the 5th Street underground wiring project, as well as $300,000 over the next 3 years into a new downtown washroom facility. And I'm proposing amenity funding. You recall council approved the purchase of 2 new sculpture walk pieces in 2020 and 21, and the funding for that will come from amenity. And I also am proposing that if we want to continue that purchase program beyond the first 2 pieces, I've got it built in at $15,000 a year, with half of that funding coming from amenities and the other half from fundraising. And that'll be a specific decision of council as we go through the process. Looking at the land sale reserve, you'll recall that roughly $2 million of the proceeds of the sale of the old fire hall were set aside for capital projects. Ray Creek Dam was the recipient of $900,000 of that already. But we've got roughly about $1 million in land sale reserve funded projects in 2020. Additional $500,000 or so proposed for 2021. So these are just proposals. For both amenity and land sale, council will be asked to weigh in. Do you agree with this use of the funds? If you do, then it's a viable use. If you don't, if you'd rather set it aside for future use, then we'll have to think about either not doing some of these projects or deferring them until funding is available. So once we put all the costs in place, how do we fund our budgets? Surplus is one source, one of the first that I look at. So I take an allocation of prior year surplus to balance the budget each year. So I don't tax for the full cost of operations. I fully anticipate that we'll generate savings throughout each year, and in almost every year we do. We have savings on the RCMP contract, just general operations. Our revenues are higher than anticipated. So for those reasons, I don't fully tax for our operations. I build in a little bit of a surplus cushion so that we're not collecting more money than I think we need to. So in the 2020 budget, we've got $350,000 of that built in. And for future years, it's a slightly smaller amount, but I do revisit every year. And once all other funding sources are built in, it's down to property taxes. So the first set of taxes I look to is the revenue from growth in the tax base, and as I mentioned, it's $130,000 for this year. And once that's factored in, the rest of it is what I term a general tax increase, which is 2.98% right now. And when we get around to setting tax rates, currently that's applied evenly across the board. You'll recall that we did reinitiate a tax policy review, which has unfortunately been put on the back burner due to other priorities, but we can pick it up as council has time for it and as staff is able to bring forward the information required. So when we do set the tax rates, the general change in assessment is factored out. Although that won't be much of an impact for this year because the average residential property went up by about 0.2% over last year. Nevertheless, to keep to our methodology, it will be factored out. And as you know, there are different rates of tax paid by the different classes of property, residential, commercial, industrial, and so on. So the total increase in property taxes required to fund operations for 2020 is $486,000. Once you take off the 130 from new taxes, that leaves 356 as a general tax increase, which is just under 3%. So of our general operating fund, about 67% of our funding comes from taxes. Roughly a third of it comes from other sources like fees and charges, government transfers, investments, and so on. This is a graphical look at what makes up our tax increase for 2020. So we're looking at, we start off with last year's level of taxation at the top. We add changes to our core budget. So what are the costs to keep providing the same level of service as last year? So we've got about $250,000 in miscellaneous operating increases, some of which I took you through as we went through the departments. Net decrease in debt servicing, increase in reserve transfers, and an increase in tax-funded capital. So at that point, we'd be at 2.79%. You add to that the incremental items, so the supplementals, the new stuff that hasn't yet been approved. That adds another 1.28. And then the first deduction from that is the growth in the tax base, which brings it down to 2.98. And as a note, each 1% increase in taxes only brings in about $120,000 for us to fund operations. So comparison I use in a larger place like Victoria, a 1% increase brings in somewhere between $1.5 million to $2 million for increases. And the impact of each 1% tax increase to the average resident is about $1.27 a month. So looking at that 2.98, last year the average residential property paid $1,518 in municipal taxes. Applying the 2.98% would take that to $1,564. A net increase of $45, so $15 per each 1%. The water and sewer parcel taxes are also collected on the tax notice. That's why you see it in this illustration. As mentioned, there are no increases proposed for that, so we're looking at a pure $45 if we approve the 2.98%. The timing of our budget process, the second meeting is scheduled for 2 weeks tonight, February 3rd at Committee of the Whole. And the goals of that meeting are to provide additional details on what you heard tonight and what's in your budget binders. And we will provide a staff report on some of the more important and the more significant items. And if council, as you're reviewing your document, if you notice any areas where you would like additional information, if you could please let staff know by the end of this week, that would be appreciated. And at that meeting, it'll be your first opportunity to ask detailed questions. I mean, if you wanted to ask some tonight for clarification of items, that's fine, but I don't expect you to receive that binder and ask informed questions the first night, so it's not meant for a question period unless you want to clarify. So There will be an opportunity for the public to also weigh in at the beginning of the meeting as well as after the second presentation I'll be doing. And the next presentation will not be a simple rehash of what you heard tonight. It'll be a little bit of that, but also additional information that should help deliberations. And we will focus on the individual items that truly impact the tax increase, being the supplemental requests, as well as tax-funded capital, as well as some other key decisions that council will have to make throughout this process. And whatever the results are of that first set of questions and instructions to staff, we'll work that into a second draft of the financial plan, which we'll consider at the February 18th meeting. So staff are available to answer questions at any time following this presentation and the next council meeting. And as mentioned, if there are any items you specifically want addressed in a report for the 3rd, please let me know or let other staff know as soon as possible. Does council at this time have any questions of clarification?
Thank you, Mr. Hisik. Leave the floor open to anybody that has any questions? No? No? We're good? Thank you. Oh, there is. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
It's not a question, just a thank you to Mr. Hisik for your excellent presentation, the excellent information that's been provided in your presentation and also in the binder, and a thank you to all staff who were involved in preparation of the budgets as well.
Thank you, council.
I see there's nothing else on the agenda tonight, so would somebody like to move adjournment?
Move adjournment.
Sorry, something, Mr. Mayor? No. Move adjournment?
I moved it.
Somebody's got a second it.
Second.
All those in favor? Motion carries. Thank you.